Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Jerry Zimmerman and Daniel Forrester. They are the authors of a new book that's bound to turn some heads. It's called Relentless, The Forensics of Mobsters' Business Practices. Jerry and Daniel combine 75 years of Nobel Prize-winning economic research with insights from criminal prosecutors to examine how criminal syndicates continue to survive and thrive for decades despite billions of dollars of law enforcement opposition. They have analyzed the leadership principles of criminal organizations and uncovered enduring lessons that every organization needs to adopt. This is going to be a very interesting show. So Jerry and Daniel, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, John.
So first of all, you both are published authors. You've done a lot of work, but this is a real departure from anything else you've ever done. So tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and then how you came together on this very unique project.
Well, let me start. For 45 years, my research academic research has focused on the general problem of corporate governance and what we teach in business schools. And the corporate governance problem is, how do you, as a leader, attract, retain, and motivate an employee group that is self-interested in order for them to work towards the goals and the objectives of the organization. And that problem has been, like I said, the focus of my research, and it's been applied to lawful companies. And I've always been interested in organized crime and true crime, from movies, The Sopranos, down the line. And the question popped in my head about 10 years ago: how do these criminal organizations survive? How do they solve their corporate governance problem? Because they're dealing with very often immoral, violent people. And how do they keep them in line and drive them in order to pursue the mob's goals? So that's how I got started, and I'll turn it over to Dan, and he can tell how he got involved in this pursuit.
Well, in 1997, I had the pleasure of spending 2 years of my life at the University of Rochester. And I was a student of Jerry Zimmerman. His writing, his collaboration with two other giants in the world of economics, Cliff Smith and Jim Brinkley, truly wrote one of the most transformative books I've ever read. It took me from a poet and an English major to the microeconomist that I aspire to be on most days, working with CEOs and boards. And I brought Jerry into a client problem I had a couple of years ago. I wanted his perspective. When you have someone like Jerry, they cut through the noise very quickly. Mm-hmm. And at the end of he solved my problem it was problematic to me. It was nothing to Jerry Zimmerman. But we started catching up as a mentor, and I asked him what he was working on. He told me about this concept that he had been toiling at. And look, I'm a sucker for a Sopranos episode or Night of Good Guys, and we're watching the Mobsters, and we went back and forth for quite a while because I had an angle to the book on the side of understanding the cultures of these organizations. That is one of my areas of expertise. And so we had a chance to reconnect, and teacher and student decades later are back thinking about Mobsters. It was quite delicious.
Very interesting. Yeah. Okay. So, what is it about? I mean, it seems like we have a fascination with these shows. I was addicted to the Narcos series when that came on, and what is it that's attractive to us about these organizations? And then, what was the spark that said, what, we really need to understand these organizations better? As we mentioned before when we got started, I'm an entrepreneur myself, and when I watch these shows, I see those entrepreneurial elements, right? The overcoming challenges and just continuing to press forward despite, whether it's rival gangs or whether it's, the government or law enforcement, they just continue to persist. And, that's what entrepreneurs do. I mean, it's a very similar thing. So was that some of the spark that led to the interest in diving deeper into these organizations?
Absolutely. It was the realization that the mafia, the five families of New York, really got their supercharge out of the national prohibition against alcohol in the
Mm,
20s. And they were fighting each other, they were killing each other, and then they figured out how not to do that.
mm,
And they basically persisted through the 50s with flying under the radar of the federal government. And then Giuliani in the 80s sent a lot of them to jail,
mm,
but they still survived. And so what is it? What is it about them that they survived, whereas iconic brands like Kodak and
right.
J.C. Penney and Blockbusters, these iconic brands were not able to change as their external environment changed. Well, these mobsters, being so entrepreneurial, when Prohibition went away, they found other rackets.
Mm,
When World War II came along, and the government started rationing basic goods, they started immediately counterfeiting and stealing and bribing and getting these coupon books. And so they have built into their DNA this survival ability that Daniel and I wanted to understand better.
mm, that's interesting.
John, for me, I will tell you, the taking your brain and thinking through the values of an organization is something I've spent decades now working on. And we're at a time when corporate culture is not only being scrutinized by regulators, but it is the instrument through which you will attract and retain. And this is a zero sum game, John, and for all entrepreneurs out there, there's a finite amount of think workers available in this country at any moment. And a lot of them that we all crave to have in our businesses are millennials right now.
Mm,
And they're racing. They are racing towards the C-suite. The oldest millennial in our country just turned 40 and can actually now sue for age discrimination. We tend to think of them as very young. They're not young anymore.
yeah.
They have mortgages right now, by the way, and they have children. So thinking through the idea of how do you attract, retain talent has been my work. And then Jerry and I to go back and forth and begin to think about what are the core values of the Bloods and the Crips? What do they hold true to? What's their
Mm,
ethos? What's their credo, as they would say at Johnson & Johnson? And the more we unpacked within it, you realize that these cultures are probably one of the reasons, they're not the only one. The four pillars explain, I think, systematically why these organizations last. But Southwest Airlines values, one of their core values is love and humor, and it's timeless, and it's helped them to be differentiated. At the same time, loyalty, steadfastness, freedom, respect. By the way, John, I hate to tell you, they value immorality. So it's the first organization I've ever studied that I had to get over that and think through, this is something, if you're going to join it and join the culture, you have to value immorality, which these groups do at scale. But there's more beyond immorality. And that was the Inquisition. That's what we wanted to tease out.
Interesting. So let's get into a little bit. So what makes these criminal enterprises so resilient, so persistent, and able to, as you mentioned, Jerry, able to shift when the external pressures come, whether it's rivals, whether it's the government, whether it's law enforcement? What makes them so special? What makes them so relentless?
Well, we study four different organizations, criminal organizations, and they're very different from each other. The Hells Angels is very different than the Mafia or the Bloods and Crips and the Sinaloa. They have different cultures. They have different corporate governance systems. The Mafia of the four is really the most successful in the way I think of it, in terms of they don't make as much money as the Sinaloa Cartel, but they certainly don't kill themselves at the same rate as the cartels do. So let me just focus on the mafia, because to me, they're the most interesting and the most self-sustaining. And I think we can learn the most about them. And they basically are organized as the McDonald's franchise,
Mm.
where the store owners, the power that we teach in corporate governance of the franchising model is that the store owner has more incentive to run that store and make money than if he was or she was purely a manager, because they keep most of the profits and they pass only a small amount up as a franchise fee to the corporation. Well, that's the way the mafia is organized. They run small crews. Each one is headed by a made man or wise guy who's been formally admitted. And these guys are very entrepreneurial, and they have very strong incentives to go out and find profitable things to steal or
Mm.
make money on, because they keep most of it. They eat most of what they kill. And so that gives them a very, very strong incentive to go find profitable things to do. And they pass a little bit of it up as tribute. But in the meantime, when you have a family in the mafia that may have 200 made men, each one is running a crew of 6 or 8 guys. Um, it's a meritocracy.
Mm.
The wise guys who are good stay in business, and the wise guys who aren't good get caught and thrown in jail.
Mm.
And so over a 10 or 15-year period, there's a sorting process that goes on. The capable, competent mafiosos survive, and they then are promoted to be captains and eventually bosses. And so when you take out a boss or an underboss or even a captain, you have plenty of people there ready and willing to be promoted into the next job, the higher job. And so, it's much like the military, where very competent people end up at the top of the organization because there's this very long process of decades of service, and everyone knows who the best people are.
John, I'd add one of the angles that makes them so extraordinary in the long run too is we use the word customer obsession a lot.
Mm.
That you should build your company around solving a problem for a customer. Well, let me tell you, there's not a lot of bureaucracy inside these organizations at that nodal level.
Mm.
And by the way, these are not products that Jerry and I would wish to participate in. But
Right.
even today, the cartels in Mexico have made it very, very clear there's going to be legalized marijuana in Mexico. And they have signaled, and they are already talking about, first of all, participating in the lawful marketplace for the first time in Mexico. Why would they miss out on that opportunity?
Right.
Second thing that we learned today, because it was breaking news, is I shared an article with Jerry, which is fascinating on this. Do you think they're going to allow their marijuana to be mediocre or milk toast compared? No, they're already imagining how can they make the product even more in a lawful marketplace. So
Right.
that customer centricity, if you will, and there we're using something that's becoming highly legalized in the United States. That was astounding. And that idea of customer obsession, just an interesting factoid that Jerry discovered as we were thinking about the title for the book. If you type in the word www.relentless.com, it doesn't at first, it doesn't take you to our book, John. It takes you to Amazon.
Amazon. Yeah.
And that's because Jeff Bezos actually imagined using the word relentless. So to everybody listening, and please type relentless in twice in order to get to our book. But that was not shocking in a certain sense, because his business has been relentlessly built around us. One click away, one whimsical choice. I mean, I don't know if I've ever even called Amazon, but my goodness, you'd think I was having a love affair with the guy based upon how many of the boxes are showing up at the house. So that was that angle of sort of customer centricity, lack of bureaucracy, the decentralized sort of nodal level and valuing that, that was fascinating to think into.
Yeah, I really, that really stood out to me. You know, my early corporate career, I worked at ABB. It was a global manufacturing giant, and we had a CEO at the time that really believed in putting authority down the lowest level. So every operating unit was just like that. So I was actually running a business, and we had full authority to make any decision, and so we sent our our tribute up to corporate, and it was the funnest job I ever had because we had a lot of authority, and we had all these people like me, general managers around the globe, doing the same thing. And I think where it stopped being fun is when we went into more of a command and control, where there was a lot more corporate directives and a lot less autonomy at the lower level. But I can really see where that autonomy in these organizations allow for flexibility, allows for, like you said, if one guy gets taken out, you've got another guy right there. It allows people to rise up in the organization. So there's a lot of benefits to that. So,
Well,
the other thing that they did, and they still do quite well, is that they have very simple, and let's get into the four pillars. Besides culture, which we've already talked about, we've also talked about task assignment or empowerment, which is the second pillar. Well, you need two more pillars here. You can give somebody a task, but if they don't have an incentive to execute that task in the organization's best interest, they're going to shirk. And so one of the things that the Mafia did, and they did it very well, is that they had very simple, straightforward performance measures. Unlike a lot of corporations I've seen and been on boards where supervisors and CEOs think that they need to have 5 or 6 performance measures, which is confusing. The Mafia kept it simple: money and don't get caught.
Simple.
Okay? You don't need a lot of accountants to compute those two things. And the other thing they had was a very straightforward reward and punishment system. The reward was 75% you keep, and if you blab, if you are disloyal, you're going to get whacked.
Yep.
And so they ran things very simply and straightforward that these guys understood. And again, I think the big mistake the companies make, companies that I've consulted with, is that I've never seen a company design a comp plan where they only have 1 or 2 performance measures. You're a manager. Okay, we're going to reward you on sales growth, on profits, on recruiting, and on diversity, and on this and on that. And before you know it, the manager who's being managed on all of these things doesn't know what to focus on.
Right. I saw that a lot in my 22 years in corporate life. Was, at one point I was incentivized on growth in South America, which I had no impact on. So I was like, all right, well, if we I hope we do well. There's nothing I could do to help it. So, yeah.
Just to add on to that, the precursor before the 4 pillars is this timeless economic principle that human beings are 4 things simultaneously. We're resourceful, we're evaluative, we're maximizing, and we're individuals. And individuals, especially in the sense of, Jerry, I often say when I brief that to my CEOs, we're born alone and we die alone. And we have a lot of things that we crave selfishly. And that's self-interest, by the way. Whether you're running a group of mobsters or you're running Goldman Sachs, that is the timeless economic principle that every leader has to confront. How do you take self-interested people who value golf, they value leisure, they value working less, they value $1 more, 1 more beer, 1 more day of vacation? It's endless. I had a CEO the other day who told me, a peer of mine in a smaller company, he was astounded that the millennials were working just on the nose 40 hours a week. And by golly, my leadership team's putting in 60. And I said, the delta between your 60 hours and their 40 hours is a utility curve in their brains that you have to discover, because they don't value giving you 20 more hours.
Right.
They value doing other things with their time.
Yeah.
And that's something, and it's really hard for leaders to get. Why don't they respond? Why don't they model my behaviors? Because they're self-interested. We all are. our premise in this book is if leaders of organizations take and confront the four pillars simultaneously, and we're asking people to do system level thinking here. You can't just say we're going to have a great culture, don't worry about performance evaluation. You can't just say we're going to be highly decentralized, let's get out of John's way. Our premise here is you have to think of this as four pillars holding together after you set your strategy. That gives you the highest probability of aligning this problem called selfishness.
I love it. So I want to make sure we don't gloss over that. Let's explain the four pillars. The four pillars as it's laid out in the book. What are those, Jerry?
Well, it's what we teach in MBA programs. It is, okay, how do you empower people? What tasks do people have? What's in the basic device that we use to do that is the org chart. You know, an organization chart basically defines who's in what box and what do they do in that box.
Right.
Then you have performance measures. If somebody is responsible for sales in the United States, they should not be measured on sales in South America.
Exactly.
The third pillar is, okay, how are you going to reward and punish these people? And companies have very complicated reward systems to try and, to Daniel's point, give people more than just money. People value more than money. And so, you know, when we think about performance measures, we typically think of compensation plans. You know, how are we going to pay you? But there's also a vast number of other ways that people get rewarded in companies. It is through titles, through offices. What sort of career path am I looking at? How interesting of a job opportunity do I have? There's punishments in these organizations. There's demotions, there is timeouts, there's all sorts of things, the way people get punished. And then the fourth pillar, which was the biggest surprise to me as an economist, was that these cultures are just as important as these other three pillars are, because I likened it to the military academies. The cultures in these military academies, and I have a number of friends who've been through them and were officers, are incredibly strong. And these people are still involved in their alumni groups. And because of the culture in these academies is so strong. And it's the same in the mafia in terms of the strength of it. People would wait 10 or 15 years to get admitted to the mob. And we have one quote in the book where a guy said, "The day I was made a made man was the most important day of my life. I've been looking forward to this for 40 years or 30 years, ever since I was a little kid." And so how you construct the culture, and we'll get into that more, can be just as, if not more important than the other three pillars.
That makes a lot of sense. So as you were going through the research for the book and looking, you know, at these stories and these, you know, these organizations, what were some stories that really stood out to you that had really good direct parallels to business and you know, the kind of things that we deal as business leaders?
Daniel, why don't you take that?
Oh, so many different stories. I mean, I think about the founding of the Hells Angels and Sonny Barger and the creation of, and that culture is a pretty unique culture, and their organization is very different. By the way, they protect the brand. That shocked me. You can't just take the brand and the logo of the Hells Angels and whimsically do what you want with it. They actually have recourse because there is some centralization, but to Jerry's point, there's high decentralization, and there's a camaraderie. I guess another sort of meta piece that ripped across these organizations. These are all male groups, by the way. We found no evidence of female mobsters. I'm not to say there's no female relationships within these groups, but it's a lot of men craving time to hang out with one another, because they also get there. You know, as we said earlier, we get utility out of a lot of different things. I know Jerry Zimmerman, if he wasn't on this phone call with us right now, he does prefer to play one more round of golf to one less round of golf. And there's nothing wrong with that. But with these organizations, they get time to not only be seen, but that, we thought a lot about it and we had to write about it. There's an absence of a lot of these leaders coming up, of an absence of a father figure, of male figures in their life. And it's interesting. I was looking over your shoulder there. You have a sign on your wall that says "Take time to be thankful."
Yeah.
I remind one of the pieces that organizations have to get right that they tend to get wrong. Two things. Most of the American workforce, John, I hate to tell you, is miserable.
Yeah, no, I know. I write about it.
Miserable. And you sit there and say, that's despite learning with the best of economics from men like Jerry Zimmerman. And you sit there and say, what is that? Why people don't leave companies? They leave places where they don't feel valued. They don't feel heard. Their endless needs are never discussed. It's interesting when we measure culture in our clients' companies. No one ever asks me for more bureaucracy, hierarchy, or harassment for measuring culture. What they ask me for is more accountability, more recognition, more career development. And by the way, that recognition piece is massive. We were astonished to look inside these cultures and discover they're pretty good at recognizing one another. Look at what Gary talked about, that moment of 40 years. That's a moment of validation. That doesn't cost you a lot that day, by the way. It doesn't cost you a lot. So I think those are just some of that's sort of the meta story, if you will. I'll leave it to Jerry to talk about a couple of the specific mobster stories.
Let me give you a couple of stories which I found interesting. A lot of companies talk about product line extensions. How do we take our core competency in one area and exploit it? And Amazon has probably been absolutely the best in this, where they started out as an online bookstore. That they developed this platform that they were selling books through, and Bezos said, well, I can sell other stuff on here. And they extended that. Now, they're now dominating book publishing. They're now dominating web services because they had such a huge web platform that they got really good at running server farms. And the Mafia has done similar product line extensions. They got involved in, well, they were always good at extorting people, and they got themselves into running unions. They corrupted the unions. They got their hands on the pension plans. They then did a product line extension, which I found fascinating. I didn't really know of this, but once they were in control of the unions, they then were doing business with the companies that were unionized. And once they got involved in these companies, they then were able to run cartels. So, for example, the concrete labor union gave them access to all of the concrete companies. And they went to these concrete companies and said, I'll tell you what, we're going to run a cartel and we're going to fix bids across all of the concrete contracts. And so, that was one thing. Another entrepreneurial activity was El Chapo, who was running the Sinaloa Cartel. He was sitting there and he was watching what was going on in the US, and he saw all of this Oxycontin, codeine problem that was in the US, and all of these addicts that were being created by these pill mills, basically being run out of Florida initially. And he knew that that was going to be shut down. So he had a large supply of low quality Mexican produced heroin that could not compete with the Colombians. So he brought in some Colombian chemists, had this big R&D effort to convert the low quality Mexican heroin into something called China White, which he knew there was going to be a huge market in the US once these addicts couldn't get their pills. And so again, that's not that dissimilar than what Bezos was doing. They were entrepreneurial, and there was just a huge amount of profits to be made here.
Yeah. So they're watching trends and adjusting the business model to take advantage of the opportunities.
That's exactly right. As we published the book this month, and Jerry and I follow the alerts. I have a Google alert on the word mobster every day, which I've had for
Wow.
3 years now. So that's been pretty fun to just read that. But it was not shocking to see a notification from Interpol out of Europe reminding the world, and especially enforcement in the United States, that there will be a black market for the most precious product on earth right now, which is the vaccines for COVID-19. And Interpol had to already share globally that they're picking up evidence of what business do you think mobsters want to be in right there, John? A black market was sure to be found. I mean, it's literally we can talk about Bitcoin all we want. It's the vaccines that is going to help our society to get back on its feet. So we've been watching that behavior. Jerry and I also were observing during the lockdowns in some of these groups how they help to enforce lockdowns in local perspectives. Why? They have connections to the communities. We talk about community activism. These groups come from their community, so there's a self-interest in preserving they're rational. That's bad for business, by the way, right? It doesn't help to have commerce flowing. So I guess to me, it's just been endlessly fascinating every Forbes article you read, or Fortune article, or Inc. magazine article, they're all wonderful, but they're all talking about 9 ways that Jeff Bezos does this.
Right. It's the same. Yeah, it's the same. We're fascinated with the same stories, and that's why what I liked about this book is you were sort of looking at a completely different group of people, organizations. They were organizations there to make money, very similar to our businesses, and yet I was just shocked at how many commonalities were between these criminal enterprises and our attempts at business and our attempts at being entrepreneurial. So,
the closest I'd ever seen prior to a study like this was General McChrystal was very gracious to us, and he read the book. I think it came back his feedback, Jerry, in 2 days.
Wow.
And it didn't surprise me. I know General McChrystal just a little bit, but this is a man who during the war in Iraq had to confront the fact that Al-Qaeda was organized in a franchise model, allocating decision rights at the nodal level with incentives that involved, their incentives are they're going to get to go to heaven and hang out with virgins, apparently, because that's called payday. Right. And when McChrystal comes in, we are using very hierarchical structures. And so he posits, as he starts to study them, that if our military doesn't begin to become like them, we're never going to defeat them. So it wasn't shocking to Jerry and I to get his very gracious review on the back of the book. But there's, again, even a group as nefarious as ISIS, you have to look at it and say, structurally, decision rights, performance evaluation, the laws of economics were even at play there, and it's timeless. That's why we think these lessons are so useful for the lawful leaders and managers that are listening to this podcast.
Absolutely. And that actually lead to the next question is, who is this book written for, and what do you hope people will take away from this?
It's written for managers, leaders, people who want to run organizations. It's really a bait and switch book, in the sense that it looks like it's going to be about the mafia or these organized crimes, but it's really teaching the basic fundamental economic principles in a way that we hope people will take away from them these concepts of self-interest and how do you use the 4 pillars to construct these incentives. The other thing that is remarkable about these organizations is that lawful managers have a whole bevy of institutions that they take for granted that help them in their day-to-day business. For example, banks, financial transactions, courts and dispute resolutions, insurance companies to reduce or share the risk. I mean, there's just countless numbers of organizations, institutions we take for granted that these criminal organizations have to have alternative ways of doing it.
Hmm.
And so, for example, the mafia boss spends most of his time on dispute resolutions
Hmm.
in the firm
Yeah.
or in the family, because they can't, if two captains get in a fight over whose territory this is, or they did a deal and one of them reneged, uh, they can't go to the court systems to resolve that. So they go to the boss.
Hmm.
The boss understands that keeping peace in the family is good for business. It's no good to have your captains killing each other,
Hmm.
hiding in the
It's really interesting. I'm writing about this in my next book, this idea of internal conflict in organizations, and it seems, it's almost a sport in big corporations, this internal fighting, and there's not enough of the somebody in charge saying, stop it. This is not helpful. This is not helping us bring money to the bottom line, right? It seems to kind of go uncontrolled in a lot of companies. At least I saw that in my experience. And
Yes.
so I think that's a big problem. It's great to see, I guess, these criminal groups have figured that out, right? Stop fighting inside. Let's go out and make money, right?
Well, the mafia's done that. The Hells Angels have a dispute resolution mechanism inside the Hells Angels. It's fascinating that the Sinaloa cartels or the Mexican cartels have not been able to figure out how to do this.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
true.
and the Bloods and Crips haven't figured out how to do it.
Mm.
So it's not an easy thing to do, but it's useful to look at those organizations that have done it better than others.
It's interesting, John. This a little piece to tuck away in your book here. The concept and culture of fear comes up a lot. There's
Mm.
fear. There's fear in every culture, right? And these groups, by the way, have a different level of fear because they're literally, you don't quite know on any one day how the day's going to go. So you have a wicked focus, right?
Yeah.
Let me tell you where fear exists, and I'll pick on a company. I've never worked for them, but at a Goldman Sachs. If I went into a Goldman Sachs and I measured their culture, and I'm talking about norms, values, behaviors, I might get words coming back to me from the surveys and diagnostics I use, like hierarchy, bureaucracy, silo mentality. Now, the regulator side, the lawyers in the building at Goldman Sachs would say that's fabulous. We don't want rogue traders.
This is what we
We don't-
want.
we want process. The 25-year-old millennial absolutely considers that an affront
Mm.
because she came out of Harvard. She's smart as hell. And she was promised an entrepreneurial environment. And yet there's fear in a system. Hierarchy is fear. Hierarchy means I have to ask Jerry permission before I go to you.
Right.
So I just think about this concept of entropy a lot. Every organization has entropy, John.
Mm.
The question is, do you have a toxic amount of it that's sucking up the capacity of the culture to live out the positive values?
Mm.
These organizations, I'm never going to get to measure the culture, I promise you, of our mobsters. But there's something through the mechanisms of the forcing of even that dispute resolution that takes the amount of fear and then knocks it down pretty quickly. There's something for lawful leaders to learn there.
Mm. Yeah. So that's you touched, that's one thing I was thinking about is, as you go through the book, as you do your research, as you see what these other organizations are doing, what are some positive leadership qualities that, folks like myself, lawful leaders, what can we take away from looking at these, crime families, these crime syndicates?
Well, the last chapter of the book and early drafts of the book, people ask me, well, how do I apply this stuff?
Yeah,
And
legally.
so we wrote a last chapter, which is a step-by-step approach
Mm.
to make your organization better. And some of the takeaways, the key takeaways are that you simply can't copy other companies' best practices, that one size doesn't fit all. Every organization has a unique strategy, a unique mission, and therefore it has to have its own unique set of 4 pillars. The 4 pillars that work in the mafia are not going to work in the American Red Cross.
True.
The second takeaway is that the world is always changing, and 2020 was a prime example of that. As the world changes with new technology, with new uh, government regulations coming and going, and new taxation, and on, new competitors coming in, that means that every leader has to be constantly thinking about, do I have the right strategy? And if I don't have the right strategy, what is the right strategy that we have to move to? And when you move to a new strategy, you often have to redesign the four pillars because you now have to change task assignments
Absolutely.
and all those things. So that's the second one. And then the fourth one, or the third important takeaway, is that leaders have to constantly look at their four pillars and ask the question, what's right and what's wrong? For several years on a couple of different public companies, I was chairman of the comp committee.
Mm.
And every year, the CEO was coming in with a new comp plan because the old one wasn't working right. And so these four pillars are work in process that
Yeah.
you always have to be thinking about and learning about what worked well and what didn't.
Mm.
And
I'll
I'll
let,
just say that
I'll let
that
Daniel complement that.
that last chat, I would only add that we took it one step just as we closed out the book. To all the listeners listening in there, what the attention, the management attention, the top leadership gives to what are the norms, values, and behaviors happening in this company. First of all, are we modeling them?
Yeah.
Because that's either a plaque on the wall, as my good friend Colonel David Sutherland said, or they're in your heart and in your head, and they're incentivized within. Culture can be a 10-to-1 return on investment from the management attention you give it, or
100%.
it will destroy the greatest ambition of the most wildly imaginative entrepreneur. And you get to set that tone from the top, from the moment you create it. I'm actually birthing a second company right now, and I'm working with just a small ad hoc group of people. It's a tech-based company, but I'm already thinking into there's a little microculture emerging here, and I want people to have ownership and accountability. So the last chapter is our best attempts to help leaders to apply this. And in the end, when you think about an organization like the Hells Angels, they value freedom. One of the things I beg my leaders to do, have a few core values. Just like Jerry says, let's not have 19 KPIs to measure the CEO against. I'd rather you have one core value that you stood for and sets of behaviors underneath it. Just have one that would delight a customer and watch what happens. We have there's a phrase that was taught to me. Unrewarded complexity was a phrase one of my CEOs.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We do this, Americans do this at scale. Simplify.
Yeah.
And by the way, don't choose integrity as your core value. Don't be the 87,000th company. I consider integrity, it's called oxygen to me. You should be fired if you lie on your time card and you steal from the company. We don't need to declare that. But you should think through a differentiated core value, something that only your company can stand for. That's what these groups do so well. Not values that you can import, but unique identifiers for your company.
I love that. It's powerful. After making a transition from 22 years in big companies to my own company for the last 5 years, simplicity, it's been fun. I mean, it's been fun to just boil things down to the basics. This is what we have to get done. This is who's responsible. It's very, very nice to get rid of a lot of the garbage that kind of weighed me down in the corporate world and kind of focus on what's really important today.
Every time I'd write a paper or do a test for Jerry or ask him a question, he wouldn't say to me, Daniel, you need to make this more complex. Never once did he say that to me.
No, not at all. Not at all. So this is great. So how can people find out more about both you, this book, and anything else coming from this book? I don't know if there's anything additional happening, but how can people find out more?
They can visit my website, which is JeroldZimmerman.com. It's Jerold. Everyone misspells Jerold. Zimmerman. And Daniel has a couple of other websites that he can tell you about, but like everything else in the world, it's all available on Amazon.
That's true. Yes.
So,
Thanks, Jeff Bezos.
right. Yeah, Relentless. Type in Relentless and then type it again into Amazon. DanielForrester.com with 2 R's and through THRUUE is where we publish a lot of information on culture. And also say to your leaders out there too, Jerry and I do a keynote speech that you could folks can consume. It's a hell of an interesting break from the monotony of hearing about the next person you expect to see on a keynote stage, because we're going to teach you the riveting view into the world of mobsters, and we're going to teach the good guys in the room, good guys, quote unquote, John, how to really apply these principles. So keep an eye out for that.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, that's the kind of keynote speech you want to hear, right? You want to hear about gangsters and, Hell's Angels. You don't want to hear about KPIs, right?
No.
So that's great. Well, thank you, Jerry and Daniel. I think this is a great book, and I'll hold it up since for the YouTube folks out here, that's a big red cover. You can't miss it. It's called Relentless, The Forensics of Mobsters' Business Practices. And I think it's a phenomenal read. And I think that I think it's really creative that you've taken this kind of a shift and looked at a completely different set of organizations and how we can learn from them. So I think it's a very powerful way to teach some really basic, important lessons about leadership and about running a business. So thank you for being on the show, and thank you for sharing all your wisdom.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.